The wind was cold that evening when David stopped his old truck near the edge of the quiet village road. He was returning from work, the sun low behind the dusty hills, when he saw someone walking unsteadily ahead of him. At first he thought it was just another villager heading home, but as his headlights brushed over the figure, he realized it was a young woman, barefoot, wrapped tightly in a torn blanket. She was trembling, stumbling with every few steps as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. David slowed the truck, rolled down his window, and called out gently, "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman froze. She didn't turn around, didn't answer, just pulled the cloth tighter around her. David could see her shoulders shaking, not from cold but from fear. He stepped out, careful not to startle her, and walked closer. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe. I'm not here to hurt you." She finally turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see part of her face. Her eyes looked red and swollen as though she had been crying for hours. Her lips trembled when she spoke. "Don't look at me," she whispered. Her voice cracked with pain. "Please." "Don't look at me." David paused, not sure what to say. She was frightened, terrified even. He took a step back, giving her space. "All right," he said gently. "I won't, but you can't stay out here. It's freezing and the night's getting darker." She didn't move. Her hands clutched the edge of the cloth tightly. "I can't go home," she said in a small voice. "They won't take me back." David's heart sank. He didn't know who she meant by they, but it was clear she had nowhere to go. He hesitated only for a moment, then offered, "There's an old cabin not far from here. I use it when I'm working late. You can rest there for the night. No one will bother you." For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with a slight nod, she agreed. David walked back to his truck and she followed slowly, keeping her face hidden. When she climbed inside, she stayed pressed against the door, still wrapped in the blanket. The drive was silent. David didn't ask questions. He could sense she wasn't ready to speak. The cabin was small but warm. He lit the old stove, filled a kettle with water, and handed her a cup of tea. She took it with shaking hands but still kept her face turned away. "You can rest here," David said kindly. "I'll stay outside if it makes you feel safer." Her voice was soft. "Thank you." "You're kind," he smiled faintly. "Kindness doesn't cost anything." He stepped outside and leaned against the porch post. The night was still. Crickets chirped, and the sky stretched wide and endless above the trees. But David couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The fear in her voice, the way she covered herself, it wasn't just shyness. It was pain. Something terrible had happened. Hours later, when the wind grew colder, David quietly checked inside. She was sitting near the fire, still awake. Her eyes met his for a second before she looked down again. The teacup trembled in her hand. "You can tell me what happened," he said softly. "Sometimes talking helps." Tears welled up in her eyes. "No one would believe me," she murmured. "They said it was my fault," David frowned. "I don't need to know the details," he said. "But I can tell you this, you don't deserve to be alone out here. Whatever happened, you deserve safety." She nodded slightly, but tears rolled down her cheeks. "You shouldn't have stopped," she whispered. "You'll regret it." David was taken aback. "Why would I regret helping you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked toward the window, her eyes distant. "Because people can't stand to look at me anymore." Her words sent a chill through him. Still, he didn't press. He quietly set a folded blanket beside her and said, "Get some rest. We'll figure out what to do tomorrow." The night passed slowly. When morning came, sunlight slipped through the cracks of the cabin wall. David made some soup from the few supplies he had and left it by her side. When she finally stirred, she pulled the blanket tighter again. "Good morning," David greeted with a calm smile. She hesitated, then nodded. "You kept your word," she said quietly. "You didn't look." "I said I wouldn't," David replied. "Trust takes time." Her eyes softened slightly, but her fear hadn't faded. She seemed to struggle with something inside her, an invisible battle between shame and hope. Then she asked in a trembling voice, "If I show you, will you promise not to scream?" David froze. "You don't have to," he said quickly. "Only if you want to. I need someone to see," she said. "I need to know if I'm still human." Her words broke his heart. He didn't move, just nodded slowly. She turned her back, unwrapped the blanket little by little. Her shoulders were bruised, her skin marked by something unnatural, something that looked like deep burns or scars that had healed unevenly. When she turned around, David gasped, not because of disgust but because of shock. The right side of her face was covered in rough, melted-looking scars, as if fire had once claimed it. But what struck him most wasn't the scars, it was her eyes. Behind the hurt, behind the fear, there was a quiet strength, like a light refusing to die. She quickly pulled the cloth back up, trembling. "I told you not to look," she cried out, her voice breaking. "Now you see what they saw. This is why they left me, why they said I was cursed." David's heart raced, but he stepped forward. "Hey," he said softly. "Stop, I'm not them." She shook her head, backing away. "You pity me." He shook his head slowly. "No, I see someone who's been through something terrible and still standing. That's not something to pity. That's something to admire." Her breathing slowed. For the first time, she looked at him directly, her eyes full of disbelief. "You're not afraid?" David smiled sadly. "No, I've seen war. I've seen pain. But I've never seen anyone fight this hard to survive." The woman covered her mouth, trying not to cry. Tears streamed down anyway. "You don't even know my name," she said softly. "Then tell me," he replied. "Anna," she whispered. "Anna," he repeated gently. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." For the first time, she let the blanket drop a little, as if some part of her finally believed him. She sat down, her shoulders trembling, but this time it wasn't fear. It was release. David quietly turned to pour her another cup of tea, pretending not to notice her tears. He knew what she needed wasn't pity. It was someone to see her as a person again, not a broken thing. As the morning light filled the cabin, Anna sat by the fire, her eyes softening. She still carried pain, but now there was something new in her gaze. Hope. David didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing. Whatever had nearly killed him to see, it had also awakened something far stronger, his compassion, and for Anna, that single act of kindness was the first step toward healing. The days passed quietly after that morning. Anna spoke little, and David didn't force her to talk. He worked around the cabin, fixing things that had long been broken, while she sat by the window watching the world outside as if she wasn't sure she belonged to it anymore. Every now and then, she would flinch at the sound of his boots or the creak of the floorboards. But slowly, the fear in her eyes began to fade. David noticed small changes. One evening, she smiled faintly when he brought her a wildflower from the forest. Another time, she laughed softly when a squirrel climbed onto the porch and tried to steal bread from the table. Those small things gave David hope. He didn't know her full story, but he knew she had been hurt deeply, and he believed patience could heal what time alone could not. One morning, he found her standing outside the cabin, looking at her reflection in a bucket of water. The sunlight touched the scars on her face, but she didn't hide this time. She only whispered, "I used to be someone else." David stepped closer, keeping his tone calm. "You still are," he said. "You just can't see it yet." She turned to him, her eyes full of confusion. "You don't understand. I was happy once. I had dreams. I used to sing in the church choir. People said my voice was beautiful. Now when I speak, people look away. They whisper about me," David sighed. "People are afraid of what they don't understand. But that's their weakness, not yours." Anna looked down. "I tried to forgive them," she said softly. "But when they called me cursed, I started to believe it." David wanted to tell her that she wasn't cursed, that the world could be cruel, but her strength proved otherwise. Instead, he said, "You can stay here as long as you need. You don't owe anyone anything." She smiled weakly. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has." "Why?" he shrugged. "Maybe because once someone helped me too." That evening, as the fire crackled, David finally told her his story. He had been a soldier years ago. A roadside blast had taken the lives of his closest friends. He survived, but the guilt never left him. "I came back different," he said quietly. "People didn't understand. They thought I'd gone cold. But I wasn't cold, I was just tired of losing everything that mattered." Anna listened silently. When he finished, she said softly, "Maybe we both lost too much." "Maybe," he agreed. "But maybe that's why we found each other." After that night, something changed between them. Anna began to help with chores, sweeping the floor, cooking simple meals, or gathering water. She moved more freely, no longer hiding her face as much. When David came back from chopping wood, she would sometimes greet him with a shy smile. Weeks later, David took her into the village to get some supplies. She hesitated at first, clutching her shawl tightly around her face. The walk felt endless. People turned to stare, whispering softly as she passed. Her shoulders stiffened, but David stayed beside her, his calm presence like a shield. At the small store, the shopkeeper, Mrs. Turner, looked up and froze for a moment. Then, instead of saying anything cruel, she smiled warmly. "It's been a while since we've seen you, Anna." Anna blinked in surprise. "You remember me?" "Of course," Mrs. Turner said. "You used to sing at the Harvest Festival. My son still hums one of your songs." Tears filled Anna's eyes. She nodded shyly and whispered a quiet thank you. When they left the store, she looked at David and said, "Maybe not everyone forgot." He smiled. "You just needed to be reminded." That evening, they sat outside watching the sunset paint the hills orange and gold. "You know," David said, "I think you could sing again." Anna shook her head quickly. "No, my voice isn't what it used to be." "Doesn't matter," he said. "The world could use more songs." She laughed softly. "You really think someone like me could sing again?" "Someone like you?" he repeated. "Someone brave enough to face the world again?" "Yes, I do." For a moment, she looked at him, uncertain. Then, almost shyly, she began to hum, a low, trembling sound that grew steadier with each note. Her voice carried through the quiet woods, soft but filled with emotion. David closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful because it was real. When she finished, he opened his eyes. "Told you," he said with a gentle smile. Anna laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise even her. It had been so long since she'd laughed freely. Over the following days, her strength returned. She began to walk into the village alone, visiting Mrs. Turner or helping an old farmer's wife with laundry. People who once looked at her with pity now greeted her kindly. Some even apologized for the way they had treated her before. One afternoon, when David returned from town, he found a note pinned to the cabin door. It read, "Went to church practice. Be back before dark," he smiled to himself. Anna was starting to rebuild her life. That Sunday, she stood in front of the small church. Her heart pounded as people gathered inside, whispering softly. The choir leader nodded to her with a reassuring smile. David sat in the back pew, his hat in his hands, watching quietly. When Anna began to sing, the church fell silent. Her voice was gentle but filled with strength. The melody rose like light through darkness, carrying every piece of her story. The pain, the loss, the